Story 6 Flunky the Fairy, Iceland. Lucy and Jonathan had just finished a fun-filled afternoon in their house. Their friends Samuel and Sophia had come over earlier in the day and were heading back to their home. As they walked to the gate to see their friends off, they saw a bunny outside, and Samuel mentioned that he had seen the same bunny by the gate when they entered. Lucy froze and then looked at Jonathan, who also looked a little startled. They knew from their previous adventures that the magic tree had sent the bunny. The tree had another adventure for them. If the bunny had been waiting for several hours, they needed to rush to the forest immediately. "It was so much fun today," said Lucy, trying to rush through the goodbyes. "We had a great time," replied Samuel, "even though it seems that Jonathan is now pushing us out." Lucy looked at Jonathan, and he was pushing Samuel and Sophia out of the gate. She waved goodbye to their friends and rushed back into the house. They grabbed a snack from the kitchen and then headed straight out the back door towards the forest. "Welcome," said the magic tree as Jonathan and Lucy ran up. "We're sorry, we didn't see the bunny. We had friends over," said Lucy. "That's okay, as you have now made it on time," replied the magic tree. "You must now hurry. There is a mystery you need to solve. You are going to Iceland. The fairies need your help. A girl will meet you there. She is a friend of the fairies." As they had done many times before, they pulled the tree's lower branch and went inside the trunk. As usual, they saw the backpack waiting for them on the inside, but this time there were also jackets. "It's cold in Iceland, so you need to wear these jackets so you will be warm," said the tree. They put on the jackets, closed their eyes, and when they opened it, they were on a beach. It was a regular beach, but the sand was black. Behind them were some rocks that almost looked like pillars. They looked around and saw an older girl walk towards them. She had a smile on her face. "I'm Helga. You must be Lucy and Jonathan. The magic tree has told me all about you. Welcome to Iceland. We are in a small town called Vik," she said. "Thank you. It is a pleasure to meet you," replied Lucy. "I saw you admiring our black sand beach. It's black because of the volcano over there," said Helga, pointing to the volcano behind them. "That volcano is called Katla, and it last erupted over 100 years ago. It is due for another eruption soon," she said, smiling at the shocked look that Jonathan had. "But don't worry, we're heading out of here. I'll fill you in on the mystery we need to solve." They headed to Helga's car, and once they started driving, she told them about the fairies. There was a fairy village behind a waterfall hidden away from humans. Helga happened to be walking there several years ago and came upon it. She became friends with the fairies and used to visit them often. In the fairy village, they had a pond that contained honey. This honey was the only food the fairies would eat. They did not eat anything else. The pond was always filled with honey. But a few days ago, they discovered that the honey in the pond was getting over. This had never happened before. As long as they could remember, the pond was always filled with honey. We need to find out why the honey is getting over, and we need to do it fast, said Helga. Without the honey, the fairies will have no food. They were driving through the most beautiful countryside the siblings had ever seen. They almost felt like they were on another planet. They passed vast open areas, greenish-brown in color and dotted with sheep. The backdrop was of mountains, volcanoes, and waterfalls. After some time, Helga pulled over. She pointed to a glacier in the distance. Lucy and Jonathan were mesmerized. They had never seen a glacier before. The ice on the glacier was a beautiful blue color. They continued driving and eventually reached a waterfall. After parking the car, the three of them walked towards the waterfall, passing wild Icelandic horses along the way. The horses looked at them through the corner of their eyes as they passed. They walked around the lake that the water was falling into and then followed Helga up a path that eventually led to a cave behind the waterfall. As they walked into the dark cave, Lucy reached into her backpack and pulled out a flashlight. There was water dripping everywhere. It was damp and filled with moss. As they got towards the back of the cave, Helga moved a large rock to the side, and they could see a path going down into the ground. The path was slippery, and they held each other's hand as they made their way deep underground. They were all quiet, and Jonathan was nervous, although he would never admit it. Eventually, they saw a light in the distance. Helga motioned for them to stop. "We are almost here. I will go alone and let the fairies know that you are coming. We do not want to scare them. They are not used to seeing humans," she said. She made her way towards the light and soon disappeared. Lucy turned to Jonathan and noticed he was deep in thought. "Are you thinking about the fairies and wondering how we can help them?" she asked. Jonathan turned with a serious look on his face. "I think I should have packed more snacks. What if I get hungry and they only have honey here?" Lucy was about to reply when they saw Helga in the distance waving at them to come over. They walked towards the light and Helga guided them through an entrance. They were not prepared for what they saw. They were in a large cave filled with twinkling lights, and there were fairies all around. Some were as tall as them, others shorter. They all had wings, almost like butterfly wings, on their backs. Many of them were flying about. As Lucy and Jonathan entered, everyone seemed to pause, and all the fairies turned and looked at them. Helga introduced them. "This is Lucy and Jonathan. They have come from far away and they are here to solve the mystery of the missing honey," she said. An older fairy stepped forward. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We have lived here for centuries, and the pond has always been full of honey. We have no idea why it's suddenly getting empty. We think we only have a few days of food left." Suddenly there was some commotion. Everyone turned and looked. It was a fairy who was around Jonathan's age. She seemed to have tripped while walking towards them. She stood up, embarrassed, and came forward to introduce herself. "Hi, I'm Susan, but everyone calls me Flunky," she said. "So, your name is Flunky the Fairy?" said Jonathan, grinning. "That's me," she replied, smiling broadly. They all walked over to the pond. Lucy and Jonathan could see a mark where the honey used to be, but now they could tell the honey level was well below the mark. "You all must be tired. Let's have dinner, and then you all can go to bed. We can try and solve the mystery tomorrow morning when everyone is fresh," said the older fairy. They walked over to the center of the cave where the fairies usually ate. There were giant mushrooms scattered around, and everyone sat on these. Jonathan turned to Flunky. "Is it true that the only food you all have is honey?" "Yes," she replied. "We don't need much food, just a little honey every day." "I guess I'm going to be hungry tonight," said Jonathan, looking sad. "Oh no," replied Flunky. "Just because we only eat a little honey, it does not mean that is what we serve our guests." She pointed to the back of the cave, and Jonathan saw a line of fairies walking towards them, carrying heaping platters of food. They walked over and placed it in the center of the dining area. It was a feast laid out in front of them. The delicious smells of fresh baked bread, pies, and cooked vegetables wafted through the air. Lucy clapped her hands in excitement. She turned to Jonathan, who quietly pointed to more fairies walking towards them with platters, this time of dessert. Lucy thought she might have seen a tear of joy trickle down Jonathan's face as he stared at the chocolate cake, brownies, cupcakes, and other sweet delicacies. They sat around and savored their wonderful meal, chatting with all the fairies. Lucy and Jonathan could hardly believe it. Not only were they in a fairy village, but they were also in Iceland, a country that was so beautiful. They sat around for a little while, feeling stuffed after such a great meal. Soon the fairies started leaving, heading off for bed. Flunky took Lucy, Jonathan, and Helga to a corner where there were 3 beds made up. The beds comprised of bundles of grass with a sheet over it. It looked very comfortable. Before leaving, Flunky pulled Lucy and Jonathan aside. "I think I may be responsible for the missing honey," she whispered. "What do you mean?" asked Lucy. "There is a back entrance to our village that leads out into the open. We keep that entrance hidden at all times by covering it with stones and grass. If it is not hidden, then anyone from the outside world can come into the fairy village. It is my job to make sure the entrance is hidden," said Flunky as she paused to take a breath, clearly nervous. Then Flunky continued. "A few nights ago, I fell asleep and forgot to check the entrance. When I eventually went to check the next day, I noticed the stones and grass were moved around and the entrance was not hidden anymore. I quickly hid it again, but it was soon after that the honey started to go missing." "Don't worry, we will solve the mystery," said Lucy comfortingly. "You go to bed now. We'll work on it tomorrow." After Flunky left, Helga jumped into her bed and was asleep in no time. Jonathan was getting ready to go to sleep when Lucy leaned over and motioned for him to follow her. They got out of bed and walked towards the honey pond. "I didn't want to tell anyone this, but I noticed some honey drops leading away from the pond," she said. Lucy reached into her backpack for a magnifying glass and a flashlight. She then showed Jonathan the drops of honey leading away from the pond. They followed the drops for a few steps and then it stopped. They continued to look around for more clues. There were no footprints as the ground was hard. Lucy was about to give up and go to bed when Jonathan spotted something. "What is it?" asked Lucy. "It looks like a long strand of brown hair. I don't know who it can belong to because all the fairies have black hair and so does Helga," replied Jonathan. "You know what this means," said Lucy, her eyes wide with excitement. "There is someone else in the fairy village, and that someone is the honey thief." They stared at each other and then slowly looked around to see if anyone was there. "We know that the thief will not come out until everyone is asleep, so let's pretend to go to bed, but stay awake and watch the honey pond," said Lucy. They walked back to their beds and pretended to go to sleep. They decided to take turns to stay awake and keep watch. Lucy took the first watch. She was exhausted, so she struggled to stay awake, knowing that the mystery would not be solved if she fell asleep. Her patience soon paid off. Lucy first heard the sounds coming from a dark corner away from them. She woke Jonathan and they both sat up silently in the dark, but kept their eyes focused on the pond. Soon they saw 3 shapes moving towards the pond. They could not make out what it was. They got out of bed and crept along the ground towards the pond. As they got closer, the shape turned and looked at them. It was a horse. They could also see 2 ponies. It was a horse's hair that Jonathan had found. Lucy immediately understood what had happened. These horses came into the fairy village when Flunky left the entrance open. They got trapped here after she then closed the entrance. Since there is no grass, they could only drink the honey, she said. 3 horses would finish the honey in a pond a lot faster than the fairies, who only had a little at a time. The horses were drinking the honey faster than the new honey could be formed in the pond. Lucy walked up to the horses and gently whispered to them. She turned to Jonathan and asked him to wake Helga up as they needed to lead the horses out of the fairy village. The 3 of them guided the horses through the entrance and out from behind the waterfall. Exhausted, they then returned to their beds and fell into a deep sleep. They woke up in the morning to see a crowd of fairies around the honey pond. Lucy, Jonathan, and Helga walked over to them, and the fairies excitedly pointed to the pond. "The honey has stopped disappearing. It's at the same level as it was yesterday," said the older fairy. "We know. We've solved the mystery," said Lucy with a smile. "Tell us everything," asked a fairy standing by the side. Jonathan was about to start telling them everything when Lucy nudged him to stop talking. "We cannot tell you how we solved the mystery. Rest assured that the honey will not go missing again," said Lucy. Lucy then pulled Jonathan and Helga to the side. She whispered to them, "If we tell the fairies what happened, then Flunky will get into trouble, as everyone will know she fell asleep and did not hide the back entrance." They nodded in agreement. Lucy then walked over to Flunky and quietly told her everything that had happened the previous night. Flunky was very grateful and promised to be more careful in the future. After a wonderful breakfast, it was time for them to leave. All the fairies gathered to say their goodbyes. Many of the fairies had come forward to hug Lucy and Jonathan. Flunky walked with them to the exit and waved goodbye from there. As they went out and started walking towards Helga's car, she turned to them. "As a special thanks for saving the fairy village, I want to take you to my favorite spot in Iceland. Do you want to come?" asked Helga. "Yes, we would love to see more," said Lucy. They got into the car and drove for some time. Finally, Helga pulled up to the side of the road. They got out and walked for a little while. The land around them was rocky and in some parts slushy. They started seeing steam rise from the ground. Soon Helga asked them to stop. "You see that hole in the ground? That is a geyser. It will erupt in a little while," said Helga. "What do you mean erupt? Are we in danger?" asked Jonathan. "Not if we stay far back. That hole goes deep into the earth and is filled with water. The water gets extremely hot and then is forced upwards. Watch it now," said Helga, pointing to the hole. They saw steam come out, then a little water, and finally a giant jet of water rushed upwards into the air. It was a fantastic sight. After the eruption, it went back to being a hole in the ground. "I'm so glad you brought us here to see that," exclaimed Lucy, beaming. With that, it was time to head home. Lucy and Jonathan said their goodbyes to Helga. Then, as they had done in the past with their previous adventures, they pulled out the golden egg from their backpack, held hands, closed their eyes, and twisted the top of the egg. When they opened their eyes, they were back at home. The end. Here are some fun facts on Iceland. These fun facts can also be found at the bottom of the written version of the story. Did you know Iceland is an island nation? Its capital is Reykjavik. Reykjavik is the northernmost capital city in the world. Did you know that each color of the Icelandic flag represents something different? Red is the fire produced by the island's volcanoes. White represents the ice and snow that covers Iceland. And blue is for the island's mountains. Did you know that beaches in Iceland that have black sand are formed when a volcano erupts? The molten lava enters the sea and the water cools it down so quickly that it causes a reaction and breaks into debris and sand. Did you know a glacier is a large, thick mass of ice? It is formed when snow falls in the same place for a long time without melting. As new snow falls, The snow at the bottom gets squished and becomes ice, forming a glacier. Did you know the Atlantic puffin is a seabird found in Iceland? They are sometimes called parrots of the sea or clowns of the sea. A puffin's beak changes color depending on the season. It is gray in winter and turns orange in spring. Did you know there are no mosquitoes in Iceland? No one knows why. That's it for the fun facts and for the story. See you all next week.